believe in heaven when it hurts like hell. Rabbi Schusterman, it's a beautifully written book. It's easy to read with modern, accessible language and anecdotes. And Rabbi, please take it as a compliment when I tell you that one doesn't have to be a learned Talmudic scholar to take real pleasure in the intellectual and religious and emotional messages given in the book. It appeals to a very far-reaching audience. This book contains great quotations from all sources, modern and ancient, and from psychologists and philosophers and other learned rabbis. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to give you a spoiler alert, because as you will hear, this book is a tribute to the testament of faith. Rabbi, you say in your book, and I quote here, "As human beings on planet Earth, we can never understand exactly what God had in mind, but the quest is to follow the clues." And Rabbi, this you have meticulously done with humor and with honesty. You have laid bare your feelings and your grief and your doubts. And so within the very first few sentences of your book, you become close to us as we travel with you and care about your journey, as that journey becomes our journey also. Rabbi, you say in the introduction of your book, right in the first line, and I quote, "This is a book for the broken-hearted." But Rabbi, your book is definitely a great gift for the broken-hearted, but so too with respect. Your audience is far wider than that. It's a book for anyone who asks the question, God, why did you let that happen? How did you let that happen? When any loss creates a challenge to one's faith, either on a deeply individual and personal level, as Rabbi, you experienced with the loss of your first wife, Rachel Leah, may she rest in peace, or on a larger societal level, such as when we think of those who were lost in the Holocaust, or in the September 11th World Trade Center terrorist attack, remembered by so many today on its anniversary, or just this weekend in the Moroccan earthquake. When anyone contemplates loss or any kind of suffering, it's impossible for most of us not to say, that's not fair. God, why me? Or why him? Why her? Or God, you might have wanted to take them, but why did they have to suffer like that before they left? This book addresses all of those issues. And Rabbi, when you were just 38 years of age, you became suddenly and shockingly a widower. You had been married for 16 years. Your late wife, Rachel Leah, may she rest in peace, was just 36 years of age when she passed. You had 11 children whose ages ranged from 14 years of age to twins of just 16 months. Rabbi, can you briefly tell us something about yourself, how you became a rabbi, met Rachel Leah, and about the tragedy of Rachel Leah's passing? What happened?
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me. And let's get right into the subject. How did I become a rabbi? One day at a time. I grew up to Russian Jewish Chabad immigrants who got married right at the beginning of World War II in Moscow. They were in Moscow. During the war years, they spent it in Samarkand, away from the battlefront. And after the war was over, they lost relatives who didn't make it to Samarkand, but they themselves survived. I have my older sister was born in Moscow. My next sister was born in Samarkand. I was born in Paris on the way out when they wouldn't let my mother on the ship because she was visibly with child, as they say. I was 4 months old when I came to Brooklyn, New York, and was introduced to the Jewish community. And I went through the standard Chabad education through its yeshiva system. with under the tutelage and under the influence of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who inspired the youth of our generation to want to serve Hashem, and also to serve the Jewish community, which meant, where possible, to leave the comforts of Brooklyn and go, as God told Abraham, Lech Lecha, go out into the world and see to affect the world. We did the same. Some people ended up in Hong Kong, and some people ended up in Long Beach, California, where I joined a colleague of mine who had opened a day school. And I became his co-director. And after a few years, for personal reasons, he left, and I became the director and ran the school. And thank God the school grew, and it reached, in 1986, it had close to 400 students. My wife was a teacher in the school, and in addition to raising 11 children, she taught every single day and was beloved. She was a very pleasant person, and she made a deep impression on the children, on her students, which she taught from 1971 to 1986, and on the parent body. And then, unexpectedly and unpreparedly, 10 days before Passover, the Hebrew Academy, the school, had a pre-Pesach program where the children showed off what they knew and what they learned about Passover. And it was for the younger grades, kindergarten through fourth grade. And with 11 children, the oldest being 14, we would have a number of children in that K to 4 grouping. My wife was there as a parent, but she also was a pianist, and she was the musical accompanier to the program. She did mention to one of her friends, I found out a few weeks later, that she was really not feeling well and she should leave, but she's not going to because she has this responsibility. She stayed for the duration of the 2-hour program, took the kids home. And I don't remember if she called me. I was in Los Angeles teaching a class in the yeshiva, and she called me on my portable phone. This was before the days of cell phones, but I did have an early generation portable phone. And she said she's not feeling well and I should hurry home and take her to a doctor, which I probably broke a few traffic rules, speed limits, and rushed home, picked her up, and rushed her to the hospital, which was 2 miles from our home. She passed out as we reached the driveway of the emergency room. They took her in immediately. They kept me out immediately. I called the Rebbe's office and asked for the Rebbe's blessing, and he should be aware to pray for her. I recited the Psalms, Tillim, as one does in a crisis of this type. And it was about 40 minutes later that the doctor came out with a somber look on his face and said, "Rabbi, we did everything that we were able to, but your wife passed away." And figuratively, I said to myself, why, God, why? My first thoughts were, this is not really happening. I read about that before, but I experienced it myself. There was denial. This is some kind of a bad dream, and I'll wake up in a minute and say, strange dream. But after a few seconds, I realized it was not a dream. And my earliest thoughts were, this is not a fluke. This is not bad luck. This is a part of a plan. I was, until then, and am still today, a believing Jew, and especially with the teachings of Hasidus and the teachings from the Baal Shem Tov, nothing that happens to a person is random. everything is planned by God, the good and the bad, and there's a purpose in this. But by golly, what could possibly be the purpose of this tragic event? I didn't think too much about it.
I just want to interrupt you for a second on that, because you were dealing with this incredible catastrophe, this shock. Your life on very many different levels needed to be dealt with. You, at that stage, at 38 years of age, was the head of the Hebrew Academy of Huntington Beach in Southern California, some 400 students under your care. In chapter 6 of your book, which when you ask the question, the interesting question, can tragedy refine us, not define us, but refine us? You state, and if I may, I'll just quote from your book, right there in the hospital, shortly after the doctor made his pronouncement, I remember thinking, life as I've known it has changed forever. This is my opportunity to put everything that I believe in and everything that I've learned and taught until now into action. Am I up to it? I was then 38 years of age. My belief in Jewish theology and that God runs the world didn't allow me to see this calamity as a chance event or that I had drawn the short straw. I saw this as a deliberate event coming from God. I did not know then nor now why God chose me and my family for this trial, but I didn't doubt it was God's plan. How did you put your action into process in terms of dealing with this trial? And Rabbi, can I ask you, how important was it for you not to be crushed by doubt for the benefit of your children, your community, your school, the students and staff, and the parents? Did you feel that this was your sink or swim moment?
Absolutely. And I give credit to my children who, using the sink or swim metaphor, if I
Rabbi, you've put yourself on mute. I think you might have just touched something and gone on mute.
I'm sorry, it's my fault.
Okay, am I back unmuted?
You're back. You're just saying, giving tribute to your children on the sink or swim.
Well, thank God I have fortitude that was built into me, with parents who went through World War II and came to a new country without a profession and without a language, and had to have fortitude to build a new family. Not only my family, not only my parents, but the entire community were people of this type who came from Europe and started again in America. So fortitude was sort of built in all around us, and I had it. I didn't know that I would need to call on that, but I did. And again, my children is one thing. I had a school. I had hundreds of families and hundreds of children dependent on me. What should I tell them? The rabbi is down this morning. Call next week when he's ready to speak to you. I just had to forge ahead, to a certain extent, to my own personal detriment, but that's what we do as Chabad rabbis. We put ourselves aside and we focus on the community and on the mission, and that's what I did. And I even gave a lecture series. 2 months later, my wife passed in April, and in July, I gave a lecture series for the parent body, because the parents themselves, who were not necessarily very observant, or many not observant at all, but they were interested enough to commit their children to these Hasidim who are teaching. They knew we were teaching traditional and authentic Judaism, and they had the same question: how could this happen to the rabbi, to the rebbetzin, to the children? And I gave a lecture series using the classic Jewish values, many of which are, all of which are in this book. But had I written the book when I was 38, I was young and not as seasoned in life and not as seasoned in this subject. It was an academic information that I had, and over from the age of 38 to my current age, I marinated in this subject while I was doing everything else that I needed to do. And finally, at a certain point, I said, if not now, when? So get it out, and here it is.
And it's a great achievement. Rabbi, you tell us in your book that you are asked point blank on occasions, does God really exist? And that question particularly comes on occasions from the brokenhearted. You surmise in your book that even in the midst of doubt, one's outrage, rather than just sadness at tragedy, indicates one's underlying faith in God. Rabbi, how does that work?
Very simply, if a person hears of a tragedy or experiences a tragedy, the standard response would be to be sad and to be depressed. If one is complaining, if one is outraged, and that is a intense feeling within themselves, who are they angry at? What are they outraged about? If one has to be broad, an atheistic view, then that is followed by nihilism, which means everything is random, nothing means anything, and frankly, life is meaningless. If we would think about the lives of animals, they are born, they go through life, and they die, and what is their purpose and what is their meaning? They don't think about it. Humans are sentient, and they have a conscience, and they ask themselves these questions. And if the feeling that the person experiences is anger and outrage, he is directing it somewhere and believes that there should be or is a system of right and wrong, of justice and injustice. And they say this is an injustice. But who are they talking to? They are talking, whether they can articulate it or not, they're talking to God and say, why, God, why?
Each of your chapters begins with a great story, often a very humorous story. And one of the small stories you give in talking about addressing the existence of God at that stage is the chap walking through the forest, who's the atheist, who's walking through the forest, who's suddenly confronted by Bigfoot in front of him. And he yells out, God, protect me. And God calls out, but you don't believe in me. And the atheist yelled out, well, I didn't believe in Bigfoot a second ago. One reaches in, I guess, is what you're telling us at times of crises, in railing against, fighting against something that they ultimately believe must exist, but then is asking that same question, but why, God? Why would you have done this to me? In chapter 5 of your book, you deal really very eloquently with the issue of anger, in which you ask, is it okay to be angry with God? And one can be angry at betrayal and disappointment with the situation one has been placed in or facing as a result of tragedy. And I want to ask you, did you feel that you were angry with God? Is that okay? If you were angry, did your anger help or hinder your recovery from grieving? And did you become concerned that your relationship with God could survive anger or a crisis of faith?
Very real question. I didn't know I was angry at God. I was harnessed to my responsibilities and didn't focus that much on myself. I had a job to do. During the first half a year after my wife passed away, I was entirely focused on the present. But then I realized that I felt abnormal. I felt out of balance and out of sync because figuratively, half of me was amputated and it's hard to regain your balance. And I searched through friends, I found a therapist. My prescription was it has to be a person who themselves lost a spouse and raised children by themselves. They would understand what I'm going through. I found such a person, an older, retired Jewish therapist who lived in Los Angeles, and I would drive down every 2 weeks and spend an hour with her and getting her insights. And I did that on and off for 6 months and came to the realization that the balanced life that you had until that fateful day is over, and you have to adjust to a new normal. It's normal to feel like I was feeling, except that it was a new normal, not the old normal, and something that I hadn't hoped for. And after that, I just kept running the school and went on with life. And my dear sister, I mentioned the story in my book. I had a sister who lived in Jerusalem, who came to visit me and spend some time with me, and came with the interest of finding out how I feel about my future and if remarriage is part of the plan. And I was open to it. And eventually she introduced me to my current wife, we've been married for 36 years. We celebrated our 36th anniversary recently. And she really went from the frying pan into the fire, from teaching in Jerusalem to joining a man in Long Beach, California, not exactly the center of world Jewry, and not having had children prior to that. She was suddenly a mother of 11. And so I thank her for that. And but we didn't have a honeymoon period. Young couples spend time with each other before, if they're blessed with children, they have at least a 9-month period of being together. We didn't have that. And after, it was, I think, 3 years later that we decided we need to take time for ourselves. And we farmed out the children for 2 weeks during the summer, and we went to Israel. That's where she lived for 8 years prior to our marriage. She was teaching. And there we were one Sunday morning. No, it wasn't a Sunday. One morning we were walking around in a quiet area in the old city of Jerusalem. She looks at me and says, "Gershon, how are you?" And I said, I thought that's a strange question to be asking at 11 o'clock in the morning. I said, "Baruch Hashem, fine. Thank God I'm fine." But she knew something that I didn't know. She was very intuitive, and she said, "No, Gershon, how are you really?" And that really pierced my shell, and I got dizzy. I turned pale, and you know that expression, my life flashed by before me. Well, not my life, but the period from the time my first wife passed away until that moment did flash by before me in an instant. And I knew whatever turmoil I was going through internally was related to that period. And I also knew that I couldn't deal with it by myself. And here again, this has nothing to do with my faith in Hashem, because a person has a mind and has a heart, and my heart had a mind of its own. My mind understood and accepted, my heart rebelled, and it took in over a 10-day period, every second day, 2-hour session with a therapist that I had known of when she lived in Los Angeles. She now lived in Jerusalem and had a private practice. And she wisely and intuitively pierced my shell and what I learned in the process is that I bore a grudge against Hashem, as it were. And with my life as I had it until then, as an observant Jew and as a chassid and as a rabbi who had counseled many people through their own personal grief, the thought that I could be angry at God seemed so outrageous that I actually denied it until it was exposed. And then I had to come to terms with it. And it wasn't that I needed to learn anything new, but I needed to just be aware of it. There are certain things that if it's dark and damp and covered, it will never heal. But when you let air in and you let light in, the decay lifts. And that's what happened to me. It took a while. It took a few months of readjustment. And I came back to who I was before. And as the person that I was before and as the person that I am now, I have a regular relationship with Hashem, davening every morning, sometimes with more concentration than other days. The month of Elul, we are going into Rosh Hashanah. A consciousness just permeates you. The king is coming. The coronation is going to happen in a few days. We better be ready. So that's how that's my story.
And,
so,
you turn anger into quite a positive image in your book. Talking in terms of anger at God is like anger at a spouse. But you don't see that as a bad thing.
Well, let's say this. Actually, to be perfectly honest, sometimes never having a fight in a marriage is not good, because it's inevitable that two people living together in a confined space, one being masculine and one being feminine, undoubtedly and inevitably, they see things differently. They can gloss over it. And for some people, rarely they can just keep living. And sometimes that's perfect. And sometimes they learn to live superficially, and the intimacy of a marital relationship is gone. It's not there because they're afraid to confront and to express themselves. In that sense, relationship with God is like a marriage. Sometimes it requires, I'll say two separate things. Sometimes after a good fight, it clears the air and you can start again, and you start on a firmer footing because the relationship survived the crisis, as it were. Marriage is a commitment to grow together. And you have, when one fights, one needs to fight fairly and cleanly. And if one can learn how to do that, then a fight is healthy. And I don't know, then I would use the term fight, but it would be a disagreement. Let's clear the air, let's get things done. But in those instances, it is the commitment to the marriage that carries you through the whatever the crisis internally might be. And I say the same thing about our relationship with God. If the commitment is there, God's commitment to us is permanent and absolute. Our commitment to God is optional. We have freedom of choice. But if you have that core commitment, then the relationship survives. And if one doesn't express it, then there is a blockage, and that blockage is detrimental. So to thine own self be true. If you have a grudge, get it out, talk it out, and clear it up.
It's a fabulously personal relationship. I want to ask you whether you feel that there is a positive value or benefit in pain, such as the pain that you went through. In your chapter 6, which is Can Tragedy Refine Us, which is such an important chapter in this book, you say in this chapter, and I'll just quote you from the book, that your wife's death made you a kinder, better person. And you write, after my 36-year-old wife passed away suddenly, I was emotionally raw for a very long time. And yet during that time, I also became much more attuned to other people's feelings. By experiencing my own newfound sensitivity, I was able to look back and realize that I had been somewhat callously running roughshod over others. While only 38 years of age, I had already been a director of a school with almost 400 students and 80 employees. And under the strain of my job, my patience for other people's sensitivities was, should I say, limited. I had an important job to do, and heaven help the person who kept me from getting it done. About a year or so after my wife's passing, I realized that my patience was growing little by little. My children needed me, and I had become more conscious and responsive to their suffering. I began to notice that other people suffered too. When you feel miserable, you become sensitized to other people's pain. When you have a sprained ankle, you suddenly notice all the other people who might be limping along, but you never noticed that until your own ankle hurt. You see that, in fact, some people are worse off than you are, and you feel a kinship with them. Empathy grew within me after our tragedy, and it's still with me. Because of my wife's death, I would like to think I became a kinder, better person. Does that mean, Rabbi, that one has to suffer to grow? And what role is played by God in that? And by that, I mean, is that the ultimate test from God?
I don't see that aspect as the test as much as a process. People, especially when you're mature, you become secure with who you are. And if you're achieving and have a responsibility for other people, you not only are you can become smug. And it's not common for people to introspect, though in Judaism, especially during the month before Rosh Hashanah, introspection is the theme for the month of introspection and preparation. But we create for ourselves a self-image, and we are happy with it. Pain, suffering, a crisis, heaven forbid, a tragedy, makes you vulnerable. You are suddenly open. And that is the opportunity for the person to grow. So, and growing through vulnerability and introspection, any changes in your character and any growth is something that you need to do. It's not imposed on you. It's up to you. You have to work that through painstakingly. If there was another way, if God would superimpose on you a better character, you would not be the same person that you were before. God wants us to grow. He wants us to be who we are and to grow. And the vulnerability of pain and suffering opens us up. And I see that we don't want it, but when it happens, we might as well take advantage of it.
The subtitle to your book is How to Believe in Heaven When It Hurts Like Hell. So perhaps the greatest comfort for those who survive and those who are aware through illness that they are in a transitional state is your discussion in your book about the afterlife, where one's soul ascends after passing from this life. You start this discussion in chapter 9 of your book, and I'll quote briefly when you say here, and I quote, "It requires open-mindedness to be willing to read about this subject and even to write about it. This is because we're trying to understand abstract and ethereal dimensions of existence that we cannot imagine." And Rabbi, then you go on to explore the following 4 topics. Firstly, what is a soul and how one can describe it. The second topic is one's body dies, but one's soul does not. And then the third topic is the afterlife is where the soul goes after this life. A place where, Rabbi, you describe as the address where all apparent loose ends, unfinished business, and moral injustices of this life are resolved. And the fourth topic is that the soul remains aware of its earlier life, and that the soul retains consciousness of its previous worldly life as it transitions through the stages of realization and refinement, leading to the ultimate enlightenment. Rabbi, I want to ask you if you can explain more about this, and I would like to know how significant, in your view, is the acceptance of this concept of the soul and the afterlife to the healing process and to reconciling oneself with God in times of tragedy?
Well, I do believe that it is an important pillar of our faith, that, first of all, the fact that we are not mere creatures that are here for 70 or 80 years and then it's over as if we never were, but we were born into this life. Born into this life as a merging of a soul into a body. And that soul has consciousness, and it has an element of spirituality, which is accessible if the person wants to develop it. And that godly spark, as it were, that we have within us, that is godly and eternal. And it's at the same time, it's not God, it's us. We have a spark of godliness in us, and that part lives on. Knowing that in the hereafter, in the afterlife, these are all words to encompass things that are frankly beyond our dimension. It's not just beyond our understanding. It's beyond our dimension. But knowing that that's where we connect to God. And if we believe that God runs the world and runs the world for a purpose, and our lives had a purpose, and that over there we will be with God whether God is going to sit down with us and give us a lecture exactly about everything that he did, or just being in the presence of God and God's embrace will make everything good, and understand that this God can do no evil, heaven forbid, but he does challenge us for purposes. Sometimes we can understand it and grow from it. Sometimes we don't, and it's just something we have to live with. Just knowing that there is, I don't know if the word is answer, because answer sounds so intellectual, but there is a hereafter where these things get resolved. That is a very positive thing that we have to hold on to when our minds hit a wall and don't know how to go further. We said, we may not know it now, but we will know it in the hereafter.
And is that the only way one can ultimately reconcile oneself with God in times of awful tragedy?
That's one aspect. That is one aspect. In other words, in the present, we don't have the answers, but we have we have trust and confidence that God, the Creator, is good and purposeful, and we need to come to terms with that and embrace that. And if we can, then even in difficult times, we feel not abandoned, but we feel that we are still with God, even though this is a challenge for us. But knowing that one day this will be resolved, that adds an additional level of comfort in the present, even though it isn't yet resolved.
And soon I'll just check and see if we have any questions, because we're coming up to the end of our time, and I know that you want to go rushing off to shul soon in order to start your morning services. As we all start to head off and grab our gin and tonics, you'll be taking something more like coffee. Can I ask you, how cathartic was it for you, more than 30 years after the passing of your wife, for you to write the book, to commit your thoughts to the book that you've written? And how tempted has it made you be to work on a second book to try and develop any of these ideas?
Well, when I decided to finally write the book, I didn't think of the word catharsis. I thought of pain. I had to put myself back through those difficult times and experience what I had gone through. And that was not pleasant, but I think necessary so that I could find the right thoughts and feelings to put on paper. But at the end, it definitely was cathartic. I was, when you know something abstractly and generally, you think you're smart. When you can actually articulate it, you feel comforted. Yes, I know what I'm talking about. Before I wrote the book, I thought I knew the answers, and I don't want to sound arrogant. After I wrote the book, I knew I can share what I've learned with others, and that was the purpose of writing the book. Others should not have to give people an opportunity where, if they need the Torah's wisdom, it's not my wisdom, it's the Torah's wisdom and God's wisdom. In this, I try to put it in the book in a modern way that the 21st century people can relate to, and I hope and pray that I've succeeded.
And you really have. As I say, I can't applaud you enough for a book that is so accessible and so readable, and every single chapter should be the subject of a discussion for schools or people of any age, because there's so much in there. And as I say, dealing with a tragic subject, but done with humor and sensitivity and real, very learned writing in a very accessible way. It's a great book, a great achievement. It really is.
Thank you.
I'm going to check with Goldie, who is our techno wizard here at Chabad, Hong Kong, to find out if anybody has raised any queries in our chat box, or whether anybody does have queries. Because if not, I might well let you off the hook and get yourself organized in the morning. Do we have any queries, Goldie?
Just before we address that, I just want to let you know that we do have a number of copies of Rabbi Schusterman's book here at Hong Kong. First come, first served. We'll be happy to share it with you. I'm now going to allow you all to unmute yourselves one at a time if you'd like to ask a question, to which Rabbi Schusterman will be able to respond. Anybody like that? Unmute yourself.
Can I ask the question?
You're on.
Okay, good. Glad to be here. It's always good for a Yid to be in the presence of Yidden. My question has to do with the anger. I think Sharon asked you if you were angry at God, and you said at the time I didn't even really know I was angry at God. And so the question is this: as a result of your childhood and your parents' experiences with the war, did they ever have some kind of anger that was there and didn't bubble up, or bubbled up, or did you have exposure to this kind of anguish and grief in your childhood as a result of your parents' experiences? That's the question.
No. Like my parents, I remember the early 50s when I was a kid in my parents' home. I was aware of the challenges that my parents had in adjusting, and my father's first working for others, and then building up a printing business, which was obviously challenging. And I heard about it. My father talking out the challenges of the day with my mother, but no, anger was not part of it. And I think after what they experienced from 1940 till they came to America in 1948, the American experience was much more pleasant, though it was very challenging. No, anger was not part of it. And while my parents were not Holocaust survivors per se, but there were hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors, many of them who led very positive and productive lives later and didn't address their burden from what they went through during the concentration camps, because they were focusing on the future. I mentioned in the book, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs talks about Holocaust survivors as a standard, and he talks about Abraham buried his wife, and then he got up and went and married off Isaac. You can marinate in the past, or you can live for the future. It doesn't mean that the past doesn't disappear, and it's always there behind the scenes, but it can be a positive driver to make the present a better place.
Thank you.
Good evening, Rabbi, or good morning to you.
Good morning.
I don't have a question, but first I just want to thank you for sharing the story. It was really moving. I don't have a question. I just have one thing moved me quite a bit, and I wrote it down when you're talking. You said God's commitment to us is permanent, and our commitment to God is optional because we have free choice. I just thought that was a very moving statement. I never heard it put like that before, so I had to write it down, and I gotta dwell on that a bit. But it was I really got a lot out of your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions?
in those circumstances, I think it's time to wind up, and thank you again, Rabbi Schusterman, for sharing so much of your valuable knowledge, your real insight, and your emotional insight. It was very brave of you to open up as you do in your book, and it's truly valued. And I would like to thank you very much for joining us here in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Singapore, all over Asia. And thank you so much for the time and effort that you put into joining us this evening and your early morning. Thank you very much indeed. Shana Tova, and enjoy the celebrations to come.
Thank you. I will say thank you to Rabbi and Mrs. Afzin for reaching out to me. It's an honor. We usually say it's an honor and a pleasure. This is not the most pleasurable subject, but it was an honor to be involved in this. And Sharon, I thank you for doing your homework so well and made this program really done well. Thank you, Sharon.
I loved it. Thank you very much indeed, Rabbi. Thank you very much indeed.
Shana Tova to you all.
Thank you.
Before you,
Shana Tova.
Yes. I would like to share with you.
Shana Tova לכולם.
Rabbi Schusterman,
I think I'm muted. No, I'm not. I'd like to thank Rabbi Schusterman and Sharon, sir, for doing an extraordinary job, far beyond what I was hoping for and expecting. So thank you very much. I would like to share with you the next Zoom event we have coming. Let me just put that on your screen here. Do you see it? Yes, this is a presentation by Mrs. Rivki Slunin, the Associate Director of the War Chabad Center at Binghamton University. And we initially contacted her to share with us the issues that students, as a reflection of Jewry in general, and the questions that these students are asking on college campuses. To which she chuckled and said, Goldie, the students aren't asking questions anymore. There is an apathy that is so loud. So she's going to address that with us next week on Tuesday, not on Monday, Tuesday, 2 days after Rosh Hashanah. And she's going to speak to us about how to inspire our youth and ourselves when the questions have stopped. So we hope that you'll join us next week on Tuesday for another inspiring Zoom discussion. Rabbi, do you want to close it?
Yes, thank you very much. First, I'd like to also just join everyone in thanking you, Rabbi Schusterman and Sharon, for making this evening so digestible and so meaningful. And having heard you quote Rabbi Schusterman, the late Chief Rabbi Sachs, I'm reminded of another quote of his where he draws a distinction between acknowledging the past and living in the past. As Jewish people, we don't live in the past, we live in the present and in the future, which is why we say first every morning, Hashem Melech, that God is king, then we go to the past and then to the future, Hashem Malach, Hashem Yimloch. The focus of the Jews is the present, excuse me. But I would like to say, just add a couple of words and say that while there's so many books that deal with these very, very sensitive and as you say, out of dimension issues, you contributed an element of reality in a way that really allows people to grow with it. And I think while we will never understand why you went through that terrible personal tragedy, one thing is very clear, that you have taken that opportunity and you have not only resolved issues within yourself, but you are helping many, many people resolve issues because there's so much uncertainty in the world today. and it's very, very. It's a debt of gratitude that so many people owe you and will owe you as they read this book. That you help them grapple and deal with the realities. So I want to thank you, as Sharon did, for getting up so early in the morning to inspire us here as we are about to finish our day here. And I want to wish you that Samchenu ki moisi nisanu, Samchenu ki moti nitanu, that all the pain suffered should one day be transformed into true and revealed happiness, and that you and your family should have a Shana Tova, Ktiva v'Chatima Tova, the Shana Tova Mtuka, sweet and good year, and that sweetness should be in the very revealed sense, in a way that we no longer need to interpret events, but that we should be able to hold the goodness of God in our hands, in our minds, and in our hearts in the most real and practical way. Thank you very much.
Shana Tova to everybody.
Shana Tova.